Imagine someone hands you, imagine they hand you a massive, unbroken scroll.
Right, just a giant roll of parchment.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, no, I mean, just a relentless wall of ancient Greek text.
No spaces.
No spaces, no chapter numbers, no verses, just letters.
That sounds like a nightmare to read.
It really does. And think about it, if you had to stand up and read that out loud to a crowd, how would you even know where to pause?
You wouldn't. I mean, not without knowing the text inside and out.
Right. Where does one scene end and the next begin? That is the actual puzzle scholars face when they look at the original manuscripts of the text we are looking at today.
It's a huge problem.
It is. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am so glad you were here for this deep dive. Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, and specifically, we're using the analytical framework of R.T. France.
Right, pulling from the introduction of his 2007 commentary.
Which is such a brilliant commentary, by the way.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in this section, he tackles the structural skeleton of Matthew. Plus, he gets into the intense geographical conflict between Galilee and Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating approach France takes here because he deliberately sidesteps giving a general theological summary of the book.
Which you'd normally expect in a commentary introduction.
Right, usually that's standard. But he already did that years ago in a previous work called Matthew Evangelist.
Back in 1989, I think?
Yeah, somewhere around there. So rather than repeating himself, he just zeroes in on the architecture of the narrative.
The actual blueprint.
Precisely. He wants to establish the structural boundaries that dictate how we read the text. Because, and this is key, if you get the structure wrong, you misread the author's intent.
Yeah, I think about how modern readers, myself included, we take our printed Bibles for granted.
Oh, totally.
We read chapter 5, we hit a big white space on a page, we close the book, and we feel this sense of completion.
Like you finished the episode.
Yeah, right. But those divisions were added centuries later by editors. The original author did not put them there.
They're completely artificial.
So, wait, if there are no explicit breaks provided by Matthew himself, isn't any outline we see in a study Bible just, I don't know, someone projecting their own ideas onto the text?
Well, yeah.
Doesn't the whole exercise become entirely subjective?
That is the core danger, and France highlights it immediately. When an interpreter imposes an outline on Matthew, they are doing much more than providing a reading schedule.
They're pushing an agenda.
Well, they're arguing for a specific lens through which the narrative should be understood. The outline you choose dictates the pacing, the thematic weight, and the momentum of the different sections.
It changes everything.
It does. It opens up a massive debate about what shape the author actually intended. If we assume our modern chapter breaks are inspired, we chop up the story in ways the author never intended.
It feels like being handed a manuscript for a play with no acts or scenes marked.
That's a good way to put it.
There's a plot. There's rising action and a climax. But you had to figure out where the intermissions belong all by yourself.
And if you guess wrong...
Yeah, if you put the intermission in the middle of a tense dialogue, you ruin the suspense.
Right.
So, if we strip away the modern chapters and verses, how do scholars actually try to figure out the original architecture?
Well, because of that fear of subjectivity you just mentioned, scholars have spent decades hunting for objective clues within the text itself.
Like internal markers?
Yeah, they look for what they call formulae.
Formula, okay.
These are repeated phrases that interpreters have clung to, like life rafts.
Hoping to find a pattern.
Right. The hope is that these specific repeated phrases reveal the author's intended boundaries.
That makes sense. Yeah, they look for a pattern. And that leads us to the first major structural theory France evaluates.
The 5 books theory.
Yes, the 5 books theory, which was championed by a scholar named B.W. Bacon back in the early 20th century.
Yeah, around 1918, and then he expanded it in 1930.
Okay, so Bacon noticed a very specific phrase that pops up 5 times in the Gospel, always at the end of a major block of teaching.
And it's a very noticeable phrase.
Right, the phrase is roughly, and then when Jesus had come to the end of these sayings.
Yeah, you find variations of that phrase in chapter 7, chapter 11, chapter 13, chapter 19, and chapter 26.
So 5 times.
5 times. And Bacon looked at those 5 markers and concluded they were the master key to the whole document.
He just built everything around them.
He did. He proposed dividing the entire Gospel of Matthew into 5 distinct books, each concluding with that specific phrase.
Let's pause and actually look at what those 5 sections are, because they are massive chunks of text.
We really are.
You have the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7.
Right, that's the first word.
Then you have the commissioning of the disciples in chapter 10.
The second discourse.
Chapter 13 is the collection of parables about the kingdom.
Yep.
Chapter 18 is all about church administration and how believers should treat one another.
The fourth one.
And finally, chapters 24 and 25 cover the Olivet Discourse, dealing with judgment and the end of the age.
So those are heavy, heavy teaching blocks.
But why 5? Why did Bacon force this specific structure onto the whole narrative? Just because the phrase happens 5 times?
Well, the number 5 was the whole point for Bacon.
All right.
Yeah, he argued that this 5-part division was a deliberately polemical move by the author.
The polemical how?
By structuring the text into 5 books, Bacon believed Matthew was creating a direct counterpart to the Pentateuch.
The first 5 books of the Old Testament.
Exactly. I mean, precisely. The Torah.
So the goal is to frame Jesus in a very specific light for the original audience.
Yes.
It frames Jesus as a new Moses.
Spot on. It creates a neat theological symmetry.
I see.
Just as Moses went up the mountain and delivered the law in 5 books, Jesus goes up the mountain and delivers the new instruction, the fulfillment of the law, in 5 major discourses.
But why did the first century audience need a new Moses? It's one thing to say Matthew used a literary trick, but there has to be a historical reason for it.
Definitely.
I'm thinking about the context of the early church, particularly a Jewish Christian audience, writing after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
That is the crucial background.
Because their entire religious world had collapsed. The priesthood was gone. The sacrifices were gone.
That historical context is everything. In a post-70 AD world, Judaism was reconstructing itself around the law, the Torah.
Because the physical temple was just rubble.
Right. So in that environment, the early Christians needed to articulate how Jesus relates to that ancient law.
How he fits into the new reality.
Yeah. Positioning Jesus as the ultimate lawgiver, a prophet greater than Moses whose teachings form the new center of the covenant community, that was a vital theological argument.
And Bacon believed this 5-book structure was the primary way the author communicated that argument.
He did. He thought it was the absolute core of Matthew's design.
I see this theory everywhere. If you pick up a popular commentary today, you will very frequently see Matthew divided into these 5 discourses.
Oh, it's incredibly common.
It has incredible staying power because it feels clean. It gives you a highly symmetrical way to understand the book.
It preaches well, too.
It does. But as neat as it is, Bacon's leap in logic bothers me.
How so?
Well, just because Jesus gives 5 big speeches doesn't mean those speeches are the skeleton of the entire biography.
France agrees with your suspicion completely.
Oh, he does?
Yeah, he offers a very sharp critique of Bacon's theory. France points out an obvious mechanical flaw.
Which is?
Yes, this formula marks the conclusion of 5 discourses. But just because a phrase marks a conclusion, that does not automatically entail that those 5 discourses are the central structural skeleton of the entire narrative.
Right. A conclusion marker is just a conclusion marker.
That's it.
It's like looking at a house and assuming the 5 biggest windows are actually the load-bearing walls.
That's a great way to look at it.
They're significant features. You definitely notice them. But they might not be holding the roof up.
That is a perfect analogy. If I give a long lecture and I say the phrase, "and that concludes my thought on this matter," 5 times during the speech.
It tells you finished a segment.
Right. It does not necessarily mean my entire lecture was structured exclusively around those 5 segments.
It could just be a transitional habit.
Yeah. Bacon took a phrase that signals the end of a speech and artificially elevated it to be the architectural pillar of the whole book.
He gave it too much weight.
He did. France argues that the narrative portions of Matthew, the stories of what Jesus actually does, are just as crucial as what he says.
You can't just ignore the action.
Right. You cannot subordinate all the action to the speeches.
Okay, so if concluding phrases fail as a structural theory, the natural next question is, did scholars look for opening phrases instead?
Oh, you know they did.
Because if endings don't give us the blueprint, what about beginnings?
They absolutely went looking for beginnings. This leads us to the structural scheme proposed by J.D. Kingsbury and his student D.R. Bauer.
Okay, Kingsbury and Bauer.
They decided to abandon Bacon's concluding markers and focused on an entirely different trigger phrase.
What phrase did they find?
They looked at the words, "From that time Jesus began to."
Oh, I know this phrase. It's actually quite rare.
It is.
It only shows up twice in the entire gospel. You see it in chapter 4, verse 17, when Jesus starts preaching after his temptation.
Right, his first public steps.
And you see it again in chapter 16, verse 21, right after Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ.
Those are the two. And based on those two specific markers, Kingsbury and Bauer divide the text into three massive chunks.
2 markers create 3 sections. Makes sense.
The first section, from the beginning of chapter 1 up to chapter 4, verse 16, deals with the person of Jesus.
The person, okay.
It covers his genealogy, his birth, and his preparation. Basically, who is he and what is his origin?
The background material.
Right. Then the second chunk runs from chapter 4, verse 17, all the way to chapter 16, verse 20.
That's a huge section.
It is. This section focuses on the proclamation.
So the person, then the proclamation.
Yeah, it's the public ministry, the miracles, the teaching, the gathering of the crowd.
Everything in Galilee, basically.
Right. And the third section, running from chapter 16, verse 21, all the way to the end of chapter 28, deals entirely with the passion.
The journey to the cross and the resurrection.
Yes. Person, proclamation, passion.
I really love looking at this because it aligns so well with how we consume stories today.
Oh, so.
Well, it's basically the classic 3-act cinematic structure.
Oh, sure.
Act 1 is the origin story. You establish the hero and the stakes. Act 2 is the rising action, the public ministry, where the hero confronts various challenges.
And Act 3 is the climax.
Right, the dramatic climax, the ultimate trial, the defeat, and the final victory. It feels highly intuitive to a modern reader.
It's a very appealing way to read the text. And France actually agrees with Kingsbury and Bauer on a fundamental level regarding those two markers.
He doesn't throw them out completely.
No, France agrees that chapter 4 and chapter 16 represent massive turning points in the story.
They are definitely hinges in the plot.
Yeah, the transition from the hidden years to the public ministry is undeniable. And the shift in chapter 16, where Jesus explicitly starts predicting his death.
That changes the entire tone of the book.
It really does. The mood gets incredibly heavy from that point on.
But there is a catch. France doesn't buy the whole package, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He agrees with the first 2 acts, but he takes serious issue with how Kingsbury and Bauer handle the 3rd act.
He takes very serious issue with it.
Why?
France argues that lumping everything from chapter 16 all the way to the end of the book into one single category called the Passion flattens the narrative.
It's just too broad.
Yeah, that final chunk of text spans 12 chapters. It is a massive block of material.
Half the book, almost.
And within that block, there are several distinct phases and unmarked turning points that deserve their own structural weight.
It makes sense that France would reject that. Calling chapters 16 through 28 all the passion is like calling the entire second half of a novel the ending.
Right. You miss all the development.
A lot of things happen between Jesus deciding to go to Jerusalem, the actual journey on the road, his arrival in the city, the debates in the temple, and then the actual arrest and crucifixion.
All very distinct phases.
You cannot compress all of that into one monolithic block and say it is all the exact same phase of the narrative.
That is the crux of his critique. Kingsbury and Bauer found 2 very significant hinges in the text, but treating the entire back half of the book as a uniform block ignores the nuanced geographical development of the story.
So we are back to square one, in a way.
Pretty much.
If we discard the purely verbal formula, whether it's Bacon's 5 conclusion markers or Kingsbury's 2 beginning markers as the ultimate comprehensive skeleton of the text, what is left?
That's the big question.
Because vocabulary alone isn't giving us the blueprint.
Right. And this is where France shifts his methodology entirely. He moves away from counting specific vocabulary words and looks at the broader canvas.
What does he look at instead?
He argues that to understand the structure of Matthew, we have to look at the Gospel of Mark.
Mark. Why Mark?
Because France observes that Matthew adheres very closely, in broad strokes, to the overall narrative pattern established by Mark.
Okay.
And that pattern is not built on repeated phrases. It is built strictly on geography.
Okay, let's lay out that map for the listener. What is the geographical progression that Mark uses and Matthew adopts?
It starts with a brief prologue set in the wilderness, focusing on John the Baptist and the temptation.
The desert phase.
Right. After that, Jesus' public ministry unfolds in 3 distinct geographical phases.
Phase 1.
First, there is a long phase set entirely in the northern region of Galilee.
up around the lake.
Yes. Second, there is a transitional phase, the physical movement from Galilee down south into Judea.
The road trip.
Exactly, the road trip. And third, the final phase is set entirely in the southern capital, Jerusalem.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this, or at least point out a massive historical complication.
I know where you're going with this.
When I read the Gospel of John, I get a very different picture of Jesus' travel itinerary.
Yes, you do.
John describes Jesus making regular, repeated trips between Galilee and Judea for various festivals over the course of a few years.
Passover, tabernacles.
He is constantly bouncing back and forth. But Mark, and subsequently Matthew, present this as one single, continuous north-to-south road trip.
It's a very straight line.
Isn't that just a polite way of saying Mark fictionalized the itinerary?
It's a totally valid question, and it is a stumbling block for many modern readers.
Because they contradict.
France points out that John's account of multiple trips is historically far more plausible.
That makes more sense.
It does. Any religiously observant Jewish man from Galilee in the 1st century would be making regular trips to Jerusalem for the major pilgrimage festivals.
You had to. It was required.
Right. Mark's presentation of a single fateful trip is clearly a systematization of the story. Mark compresses the timeline.
But does that mean we just toss out the historical reliability of the text? If we acknowledge that the authors rearranged the timeline, how do we trust the narrative?
We have to evaluate the text based on the literary conventions of its own time, not the conventions of modern investigative journalism.
That's a fair point. We bring our own expectations.
Right. Ancient biography, a genre known as bios, operated with different rules.
Bios, like Plutarch.
Yeah, like Plutarch. Ancient writers routinely prioritized thematic truth and dramatic coherence over strict diary-like chronological itineraries.
So they weren't trying to write a minute-by-minute logbook.
No, not at all. They organized material to highlight the meaning of the subject's life. By structuring the story as a single, monumental progress from the northern province to the southern capital, Mark creates a powerful narrative arc.
So they're organizing the true events into a specific frame to make a point.
Precisely.
They compress a multi-year reality into a single geographical clash to draw intense attention to the hostile reception Jesus receives.
It turns up the volume on the conflict.
It turns a series of routine festival visits into a singular, undeniable collision between the Galilean prophet and the Judean establishment.
Spot on. And France points out a fascinating detail. Matthew actually drops numerous hints that Jesus had been to Jerusalem before this final climactic trip.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Matthew knows the history is more complex than the simple geographical outline he is using.
Give me some examples. Where does Matthew tip his hand that Jesus is not a first-time visitor to the capital?
Well, when Jesus arrives near Jerusalem in chapter 21, he already has established supporters ready and waiting.
You mean with the triumphal entry?
Yes. He tells the disciples where to find a donkey, and it's full, implying a prearranged agreement with the owners.
Right, he doesn't just steal a donkey.
No, he knows the people.
Mhm.
Later, he knows who will host the Passover meal for him and his disciples.
The man with the water jar. That requires prior coordination.
Definitely. And even more explicitly, in chapter 23, Jesus stands over the city and laments, saying, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing."
How often?
Right. You cannot say how often if this is your very first visit to the city.
That's a huge giveaway.
Matthew is not denying the complex historical reality of multiple visits. He is simply organizing his primary narrative around a single, massive geographical arc for maximum literary impact.
That is brilliant. He leaves the clues there for the attentive listener to see the historical reality, but he chooses to build his primary structure around the geographical drama.
Galilee to Jerusalem.
The country to the capital. The place of popularity to the place of ultimate rejection.
It gives the narrative a clear, undeniable forward momentum.
You can literally feel the tension rising the further south Jesus travels.
And that rising tension makes the climax all the more devastating. However, Matthew makes one major departure from Mark's geographical outline, and it happens right at the very end of the story.
Well, Mark's original ending is notoriously abrupt.
Very abrupt.
The women flee the empty tomb in terror, and they say nothing to anyone. It leaves the reader hanging. But Matthew does something entirely different with the geography.
Yes, France highlights this departure as a brilliant piece of narrative closure. Matthew features a highly dramatic return to Galilee in chapter 28.
Going back north.
Right. After the absolute disaster in Jerusalem, after the betrayal by Judas, the arrests, the sham trial, the crucifixion, and the scattering of the disciples, where does the narrative finally resolve?
It goes back to the
It
beginning.
goes back to Galilee.
The Great Commission. They go back to a mountain in Galilee.
Yes. The Messianic mission is triumphantly relaunched in the exact geographical location where it originally started.
It's the ultimate cyclical ending.
It brings the entire geographical tension full circle. Galilee isn't just a spot on a map, it becomes thematic ground zero for the entire movement.
Bypassing Jerusalem at the end is a massive theological statement.
It's a huge rejection of the capital.
The holy city, the center of the religious establishment, is left behind. The new covenant mission, the command to go and make disciples of all nations, is launched from the backwoods.
Yeah, from the margins.
It's like the classic hero's return in epic literature. The hero starts in a humble, obscure hometown. They have to leave that safety to face the ultimate trial in the terrifying capital city.
The belly of the beast.
Right. They face death there. But the resolution isn't taking over the capital and sitting on a physical throne there. The resolution is returning to the humble hometown, returning changed, victorious, and ready to send a global message.
By taking the story back to Galilee, Matthew highlights the stark contrast between the rejection by the religious establishment in Jerusalem and the worldwide scope of the new mission being launched from the obscure northern province.
Is beautiful symmetry.
Now, Mark had actually hinted at this reunion in his text.
He did.
Yeah, in Mark 14, Jesus promises that after he is raised, he will go ahead of them to Galilee. The angel at the tomb repeats that promise. But Matthew doesn't just hint at it. He explicitly narrates the scene. He makes the return to Galilee the crowning moment of the entire book.
To truly grasp the weight of this tension, to really feel what it meant for this specific narrative, to move from Galilee to Jerusalem and then back again, we have to correct a massive historical misconception.
Yes, we do.
This brings us to a crucial part of France's introduction, the geopolitical divide. France argues that most modern readers have a completely skewed view of what first-century Palestine actually looked like.
It is true. Modern readers tend to operate on a very flattened, simplified assumption.
We look at the map at the back of our Bibles.
With all those pastel colors.
Yeah, the pastel colors. And we assume that the entire region was populated by an undifferentiated, homogeneous community of people who were all united amicably under the shared, terrible burden of Roman occupation.
We think of it as one big, unified country called the Holy Land.
Everyone is on the same team, facing the same Roman enemy. The only conflict we imagine is between the locals and the imperial soldiers.
But France, citing prominent historical scholars in this area like Geza Vermes, Sean Frayne, and Richard Horsley, calls that unified assumption a gross distortion.
A gross distortion. That's a strong language.
It completely misses the historical and cultural reality on the ground.
So let's break down that historical reality. What was the actual relationship between the region of Galilee in the north and the region of Judea in the south?
It was a relationship defined by intense separation and mutual suspicion.
How far back does that go?
You have to go all the way back to the death of King Solomon centuries earlier, when the unified monarchy split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom.
Oh, right, Israel and Judah.
Ever since that fracture, the two regions developed differently. Galilee was conquered by the Assyrians long before Judea fell to Babylon.
So they have different trauma, different histories.
Yeah. By the 1st century, Galilee was a distinct province with its own unique history, its own political administration under Herod Antipas, and its own distinct cultural flavor.
I try to think of a modern comparison to make this sociological dynamic click.
It helps to ground it.
It's like the cultural disconnect between an agrarian working-class province and an elite cosmopolitan capital.
Think like rural Appalachia versus Wall Street.
Yes. Imagine someone from a rural farming community traveling down to the financial and political center of the nation. They speak with an accent, their customs are slightly different, they are viewed as unrefined.
And when that unrefined outsider comes into the capital city acting with authority, claiming to speak for God, criticizing the established temple system...
They are not welcome as a hometown hero.
Definitely not. They are viewed with intense suspicion and hostility. They are a rustic outsider threatening the delicate political balance that the elite have struck with the Roman occupiers.
Give me some concrete examples from the text. Where does this geopolitical tension actually flare up in the narrative? We read these chapters all the time, but we often miss the sociological subtext.
The clearest example of the cultural divide is Peter in the courtyard during Jesus' trial.
By the fire.
Right. The servant girl recognizes Peter not just by his face, but by his voice. She says, "Your accent betrays you."
His Galilean dialect marked him as an outsider in Jerusalem.
He sounded like a northerner.
You couldn't hide it.
No. Furthermore, you see the economic differences. Galilee was largely agrarian, focused on farming and fishing.
Which explains all the parables.
Right. The parables Jesus tells are full of agricultural imagery, sowing seeds, pulling weeds, catching fish.
Because that's what the Northerners knew.
Exactly. Jerusalem, on the other hand, was dominated by the temple economy, aristocrats, and the priesthood.
Big money.
Big money. When Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple, he is a northerner attacking the economic engine of the southern elite.
The regional prejudice is palpable. Remember when Nathanael asks earlier in the story, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?"
Such a great line.
That sneering attitude is the baseline perspective the Jerusalem establishment would have had toward a movement entirely based in Galilee.
When you realize the intense geopolitical separation between these two regions, it changes how you read every interaction between Jesus and the religious leaders in Jerusalem.
The Pharisees and Sadducees aren't just debating abstract theology with Jesus.
No, they are dealing with a rogue Galilean preacher who is stirring up massive crowds in their city during a volatile festival season.
It adds an entire layer of sociological tension to the theological debate.
The geographical structure, France points out, isn't just about drawing lines on a map to track travel miles.
It's a barometer.
Yes. It is about tracking the rising temperature of regional conflict. The movement from Galilee to Jerusalem is a movement from safety to extreme danger, from the supportive margins to the hostile center.
All of the structural analysis, tracking the concluding phrases, identifying the turning points, following the geographical map from north to south, assumes that the audience can actually hold all of this in their heads.
Right, which is a big assumption.
And that leads us to a fascinating question about how the original audience actually consumed this story. We keep using the word reading.
Like they had paperbacks.
Yeah, we talk about what the reader sees. But France points out that calling Matthew literature in a modern sense might actually be anachronistic.
It is, because the vast majority of the first century audience could not read. Literacy rates were incredibly low.
Maybe 5 or 10%.
At best. They didn't have a personal copy of a codex to sit in a quiet room and study at their own pace.
So how did they interact with the gospel?
They experienced the text as a communal oral presentation. They heard it spoken aloud in a gathering.
This changes everything about how we analyze the structure. Let's compare Mark and Matthew again through the lens of an oral audience.
Okay.
Scholars widely recognize that Mark is fast-paced, action-oriented, and relatively short. It is highly likely that Mark was performed orally in a single session.
You could read it in about 90 minutes.
Right. You could sit a congregation down, and an hour or two later, they have heard the entire Gospel of Mark from start to finish.
It's like going to the theater to watch a fast-paced play. It's intense, it's immediate, and you get the whole narrative arc in one sitting.
The audience can easily track the movement from Galilee to Jerusalem because it happened so quickly.
But Matthew is a completely different beast.
Matthew is significantly longer. It is massive.
It's almost double the length.
It contains abundant, dense material. There are intricate theological arguments rooted in Old Testament scripture that require serious mental processing.
And as we discussed earlier with Bacon's theory, there are those 5 massive, concentrated blocks of teaching.
France asks a very practical question here. Is it really plausible to envision an eager audience drinking in the entirety of the Gospel of Matthew at a single sitting?
The cognitive load would be overwhelming.
Just exhausting.
Think about it. To absorb the opening genealogy, the entire Sermon on the Mount, the complex collection of parables, the intricate debates with the Pharisees, and the entire grueling passion narrative in one breath is almost unthinkable for a listening audience.
Human attention spans simply cannot hold that much dense oral information at once.
Even back then.
I love this line of thought. France suggests that Matthew might have been presented in installments.
Like a serialized story.
Trying to absorb the entire gospel in one sitting is like trying to watch a 12-hour movie. You lose the details, you lose the emotional weight. But what if it was consumed more like a gripping weekly series?
France references a scholar named A.J.P. Garrow, who proposed a very similar theory regarding the Book of Revelation.
Garrow, okay.
Garrow suggested Revelation was designed for oral presentation in 6 distinct gripping installments.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And France wonders if a similar mechanism might have been intended for the Gospel of Matthew. The internal structures we have been discussing might actually be the episode breaks.
So maybe those 5 massive discourses we talked about earlier were designed as natural pausing points,
That would make sense.
a place for the audience to digest the teaching before returning for the next segment. Or maybe the geographical shifts provided the episode breaks.
You can almost hear the cliffhanger.
Right. Tune in next week as Jesus finally crosses the border into Judea.
While we cannot definitively prove it was delivered in specific installments, thinking about it that way forces us to appreciate the structural brilliance of the text.
It totally changes the vibe.
Think about how an attentive listening audience would process the rising tension. Over weeks of listening, they would track the geographic progression from Galilee to Jerusalem.
A slow march.
They would feel the suspense building week after week much more intensely than we do when we silently speed read the text alone over a weekend.
When you are listening in a group week after week, you are anticipating the clash. You know the Galilean has to face Jerusalem. The tension becomes communal.
It's a shared experience.
The structure France outlines, the long Galilee phase, the transitional journey south, the Jerusalem climax, and the surprising Galilee return is the perfect framework for a serialized oral performance. It gives the listening audience a cognitive map.
Even without seeing chapters and verses on a page, the audience hears the location change.
They pick up on the cues.
They hear the teaching blocks conclude with that specific formula Bacon identified. They recognize the turning points Kingsbury highlighted.
They know exactly where they are in the story.
They can discern the continuity and the force of the plot. They appreciate the buildup of dramatic tension and theological challenge because the author has built those structural markers directly into the rhythm of the language.
This has been a massive shift in perspective for me. To synthesize what we have covered today, France is showing us the skeleton beneath the skin of the text.
He really is.
By recognizing the geographical structure and the historical reality of the geopolitical divide, our engagement with the narrative is completely changed.
We stop seeing a random collection of moral teachings dropped from the sky, and we start seeing a meticulously crafted, escalating drama grounded in history.
It's a real story about real conflict.
We see how the physical movement from north to south drives the theological argument. We recognize the brilliance of an author who organized this historical material to maximize its impact on an audience that was hanging on every spoken word.
It makes the text feel three-dimensional. We're no longer just looking at flat words on a page. We are tracking a dangerous movement across a hostile landscape.
You feel the heat of the conflict.
We see the sociological friction. We feel the danger of the Galilean outsider confronting the Judean elite. Which leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
It's a challenging thought, too.
We started by talking about reading an unbroken manuscript, trying to find the act breaks like a detective. Think about your own modern habits. We read silently.
We read alone.
We read in short, fragmented bursts based on reading plans. We are entirely fixated on little numbered chapters and tiny verses. Could it be that these modern conveniences are actually shielding you from the raw, escalating momentum of the original story?
We've insulated ourselves from the drama.
The next time you open a familiar text, ask yourself, what structural biases are you bringing to the table? And what original, overwhelming narrative momentum might you be missing because you were looking at the chapter numbers instead of feeling the ground shift beneath the character's feet?